Hello and welcome to the Online Ethics Center's Fall 2021 webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation. I am Caitlin Wiley. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an assistant professor in science, technology, and society at the University of Virginia, where I teach engineering ethics and data ethics. And the Online Ethics Center is hosted at the University of Virginia. It is a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics in engineering and science. The OEC also fosters an active community made up of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who come together to share knowledge and discussion about ethics. So please check out our website at onlineethics.org. So the theme for our fall webinar series is data ethics, and it is sponsored by the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. And I am delighted to host our speaker today, Dr. Lauren Hoffmann. Dr. Hoffmann is an assistant professor at the Information School at the University of Washington. She studies data technologies, ethics, and justice. Her recent work has explored the limits of inclusion as a solution to problems of data and discrimination, and you can find that in the journal New Media and Society. Also, she's a co-PI on the NSF-funded project, Emerging Cultures of Data Science Ethics in the Academy and Industry, for which she co-authored this awesome report on teaching data ethics that I'm going to drop in the chat, and that was in your invitation email. So what's going to happen today is Dr. Hoffmann will speak first, and then she's going to have a discussion with Dr. Jess Rhea, who is an assistant professor of responsible data science here at the University of Virginia. And then we'll have time for questions from you. So if you want to ask a question, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll read your question to Dr. Hoffmann and Dr. Rhea in the question period. So thanks for joining us. It's great to have you. And Dr. Hoffmann, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Caitlin. Thanks for having me. Did my camera just change? Did my camera just shift the angle? It's doing weird things on my end. Okay. All right, but we'll be fine.
Yeah, you look good.
Awesome. I'm gonna go ahead and just jump right in here. I just have a few slides to give some background. And what I want to talk about today is some work I did in concert with Katherine Alejandra Cross, who I'll mention. I'll talk about more in a second. Here at the University of Washington as part of a broader project, thinking about the lack of sort of systematic or unified or agreed upon conceptions of what the content and approach to teaching ethics in the context of data science should look like or could look like. And one of the approaches we took to this was thinking about was to think about antecedents. And there's some precedent for this. I'm thinking about work by folks like Jake Metcalf, who looked at sort of antecedents and connections in data science ethics from, for example, research ethics or histories of professional ethics and as well as journalism ethics. And I've done some other work on this with my colleague Luke Stark, who's at Western up in Canada, looking at sort of the metaphors and concepts we appeal to and how that might link up to when we talk about data and the problem of sort of data science, and how that might link up to professional codes of ethics and models for professional ethics. But in this one, we wanted to really kind of stay in a what I think for some folks would be a familiar domain. It was in engineering and computer science education, and in particular focusing on what's the scope, what's the arc, what's the nature of the discussions of something like ethics education in the context of engineering and computer science. And so it's one of those things where it's really easy. I think we often get caught. And I've only been doing this work for 10 years only, but you often run into moments where you feel like we're having the same conversation. I feel like we had this conversation before, and so this was an opportunity to kind of zoom out and take stock across a number of works and efforts. And so what we did, it was a comprehensive sort of high-level review of literature in engineering and computer science ethics education. We targeted both scholarly databases, the UW Libraries General Access Portal, as well as specific journals and conferences and conference proceedings where we knew these conversations lived. And ultimately, we ended up collecting and reading and organizing more than themes from more than 300 works. These included journal articles, conference papers, editorials, and comments that appeared in these kinds of publications, and as well as some books. Notably, we bracketed. We did not look for industry or professional organization white papers, other kinds of conversations that might have been happening in other texts. And that is both, a way of making a project tractable, but also presents a limit. And so I want to be cognizant of the nature of the conversation that we were tracking here. And in that sense, this should be considered, a springboard for further development and conversation, and not the sort of end of the story. And we also use ethics as our sort of organizing keyword in our searching, in tandem, in concert with terms around pedagogy and teaching and education. But we really did sort of focus on ethics, which I think is justifiable given the role it has played as an organizing term for sort of normative and moral considerations in professions. But at the same time, it means we're going to miss related conversations around, say, professional responsibility or justice, if those, or inclusion or diversity, for example, if those works were not also situating themselves relative to ethics, to professional ethics. So, that is also a bracket, and to note, I think a justifiable move, again, given the dominance of ethics as the framework for these conversations. And then also language limits. English language. We focus on English language articles, and that obviously that is obviously a particular perspective and problematic in its own right. Not sort of unique to us, but to the sort of English speaking academy generally. So I do want to note those as limitations. We had about a dozen ad hoc themes when we started working, and shout out to, I skipped a slide, so I got to jump back. Shout out to Katherine Alejandra Cross, who works with me here at the University of Washington, who did a lot of the research and writing legwork up front, and then we developed the report out of sort of conversations and multiple rounds of synthesizing what we found in the readings. So Katherine was a co-author on this report, absolutely instrumental to it getting done. And I want to note that this work was supported by an award by the National Science Foundation, and the PIs in that project are Deidre Mulligan at Berkeley, Karen Levy at Cornell, Solon Brokus at Cornell, and then myself at Washington. And this would not have been possible sort of without the conversations. They are all sort of chipping away at various parts of this project, and this was, a piece that we tackled here at Washington. But it certainly emerged out of conversation. And then additional thanks to Carol Plummer and Megan Finn, who are at the iSchool at Washington with me, who put eyes on the report and gave a lot of valuable feedback as it was being developed and along the way. So I skipped that slide earlier, and I just want to acknowledge that. So along with Katherine, we condensed these ad hoc themes into five, sort of what we saw as five major areas of focus. And you can go into the report, you'll see, we focus on, there's a set of work on histories and foundations. There's a set of work on how you design courses to cover ethical topics. And then there's a lot of work on sort of exercises and pedagogical tools. What are people doing in the classroom to teach this? And then there's an extensive body of literature, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, of evaluating sort of the efficacy of ethics interventions in curriculum at a programmatic level, so not just in a single classroom. And then a set of what we would call critical interventions, where they are explicitly oriented at changing the scope, focus, or topic of professional ethics education in engineering and computer science. And a lot of these conversations revolve around, say, reorienting concerns around social justice, reorienting concerns around feminist ethics and care ethics, reorienting discussion around questions of virtue and character. So you see, instead of sort of Western-based, action-based ethical models. So, so you certainly see a robust sort of conversation in that regard. And some period style themes that are worth noting is we found articles going back more than 100 years. As long as engineering has been a profession, people have been talking about the social and ethical content of education for engineers, full stop. So I find it amusing when you hear, if you ever hear people say, oh, these concerns are really new, it's just these people that are concerned with social justice that are bringing, that are suddenly forcing this content on us. No, this has never not been a part of the conversation, though it has sort of evolved over time. And in the 1960s through the 80s, I think you see what we could probably call the formative period, where it really starts to take on an identity as a domain, in response to political crises, in response to social movements, to the civil rights movement, to the women's rights movement. You see a sort of renewed and concrete focus on engineering and computer science, in particular engineering, as situated in the same world where those things are happening. And then from the 90s onward, you really see a shift towards auditing and evaluation. You really see people focusing on how do we measure the efficacy of these programs, which corresponds towards a broader sort of shift towards auditing and evaluation in the academy in the 90s. So unsurprising that engineering computer science ethics education would be caught up in that. And then we look for some continuities with data science ethics education, and some things really jump out. One thing that strikes me about the conversations about teaching data science ethics today is the need for case studies, the development of case studies, the focus on case studies. And case studies are a clear theme, a clear driver of how ethics is taught in engineering and computer science education. So perhaps no surprise there. But among these case studies, I think it's interesting to flag the way that crisis or sort of spectacular moments serve to congeal our focus or serve to direct our focus. I remember Katherine coming to me one day, just like, if I have to read about the Challenger explosion again, right? Like not to minimize the tragedy of the event, but it was really these kinds of like Chernobyl, the Challenger. We even found, before that, attention to the Hindenburg, right? In older, in some of the more historic literatures, that there were these really spectacular moments that served as like a kind of both a rupture and a rallying cry, right, for folks interested in ethics. And so much literature is dedicated to them. And you find similar things happening, I think, in data science conversations around data science ethics education, whether it's the Compass criminal recidivism prediction algorithm, whether it's very sort of specific cases of people being wrongfully flagged by facial recognition technologies, for example. I think you see some of that history or some of that style of thinking also playing a role. There's also a continuous theme of arts and literature, which might be somewhat surprising. So if you're somebody who thinks that, like, we really need to sort of reassert the importance of the humanities to STEM education, well, that's also not new. That's also not at all new. We found discussions. There's discussions of what it would mean to teach Antigone and classics and Greek tragedies in an engineering classroom, right? These conversations going back decades. And you see an increasing focus on the efficacy of using sci-fi as a speculative or imaginative device to open up onto ethics conversations, which is certainly a theme in data science ethics conversations today. You see the shift towards embracing speculative design, embracing shows like Black Mirror as a way to engage students on these topics. And then there's the forever debate around standalone versus integrated education efforts, right? Whether we're going to do this in standalone courses dedicated to social and ethics topics, or we're going to weave those topics throughout the entirety of a program or the entirety of a curriculum. It's a common conversation. It's a continued conversation. It's an unsettled one. And then you also see, I think, the same pattern of critical gestures, the adopting of professional ethical frameworks that have limits for addressing histories of exclusion, for addressing questions of justice and equality or equity. And so you see some of these same conversations that were happening, have been happening throughout the history of engineering and computer science ethics education, happening throughout data science ethics education. But the last thing I want to note then, though, is so we see these themes and we see these continuities, and the question I kind of want to pivot to as we then open it up for further discussion is, to what degree do we want to preserve, retain, or carry those kinds of continuities forward, and where perhaps should we be breaking from particular traditions? And for me, that's a question of what kind of problem is data science, what kind of problem are data technologies, and then what kind of problem is data science ethics in view of that. I think a lot about the foundational work of somebody like Oscar Gandy and his text from the early 90s, The Panoptic Sort, I would consider that foundational for understanding the ethics of the application of data science to social, political, and economic problems in the world. And one of the things that one of the arguments that he makes, and one of the things that he shows, is that discrimination, both in a sort of loaded sense, but also in a neutral sense, is foundational to what these tools do, foundational to what data science does. And if discrimination is not an unintended consequence of these practices, but rather inherent to them, data science is perhaps a different ethical challenge. How does that? What kinds of histories and discussions does that require us to bring to bear versus some of the antecedents in engineering and computer science? And so here I would just note there are some discussions, especially in feminist ethics of engineering, around the ethics of problem formation. Donna Riley talks about this in relationship to the formation of sort of grand challenges for sort of engineering as a profession, or computer science as a profession, that the idea of a grand challenge as the way to talk about a problem itself invites interrogation. And so that's a thread that perhaps we have not carried through, but need to revive, to think about how we conceive of and frame the problems of data science. And then I'll just also say, I think we might want to think a little bit less about, or a little bit more about, the success and the prominence of data science as an endeavor in the academy and in industry, not as revealing something true about the world or about what's valuable in the world, but as a kind of accomplishment. And I don't mean an accomplishment in the like sort of positive normative sense of like, woohoo, go us, but as something that is accomplished through a set of political, economic, academic, methodological, other and political processes that that allows it to sort of sit in hold the position that it holds in our popular discourse, in academic development, in program development, in student recruitment. And if we think of it in that kind of processual way, as opposed to just a mere sort of tool for revealing or creating value in the world, I think that opens up new avenues for thinking about ethics relative to data science. How did we get here, and how do we intervene to perhaps change certain conversations in the future? So that was a little bit vague, but on purpose, because I want to open it up and have a conversation with Jess. I'm so excited for that. And thanks for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoffmann. It's so helpful to hear you frame it as a choice. Like the future of data science is the future of data ethics, rather, is something that we should think about and reflect on and make a choice about how it should be, rather than just adopting what seems obvious.
Yeah.
Super cool. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Rea. Dr. Jess Rea is a free culture activist working on public interest advocacy and research that addresses power relations between technologies, people, and spaces. They are an assistant professor of responsible data science at the University of Virginia. Their recent work investigates how smart city markets in Brazil and Canada can exacerbate inequalities. So please, Dr. Rea.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for the invitation, and thank you, Anna, for this great presentation. I'm really, really happy to join this conversation today. So this report is such a fantastic resource for all of us teaching data ethics and thinking about the responsibility of data science beyond ethical issues, and you address many topics that have been on my mind lately. So my questions are based on the report and also on the work we have been developing and want to pursue in the School of Data Science at UVA. So I'll be drawing from that. I'd like to start with your last questions, the one that you left for us. What kind of problem is data science ethics? So we've been discussing other aspects to advance this idea of responsible data science here, such as should we include governance issues? Should we include regulatory frameworks, policy design and evaluation? Should we bring people from other areas beyond social sciences as well, like law and humanities? How can we include them? So I think my first question would be, does it make sense for you to shift our approach from data ethics and teaching data ethics to the responsibility and even accountability of data science in the curriculum?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you. Just like, this is really, this is interesting. There's this kind of, I've many of us have noticed this and or have been involved in it, is this shift, away from ethics as the framing to say responsible data science, responsible AI is a big thing. It's not only a shift in sort of like how programs are talking about it, but how funders are looking at it, how companies are talking about work. And I think it actually mirrors some other debates or conversations that are happening around the same topics, around in say activist or advocate or more critical scholarship, where there's a debate over, is ethics the framework, or do we need to appeal to justice? Should we be talking about data justice instead of data ethics, et cetera? And part of me is sort of really uninterested in the sort of linguistic parsing of like how we describe this thing that we're doing. And I don't say that pithily. I say that, to recognize that I do recognize that in some cases this is just mere branding, right? That people use. I think those of us that have done this for a little while, we were first. It was what were we doing? Like algorithm stuff was under Web 2.0, and then we were talking about big data, and now nobody talks about big data, and then it was like, then we had to talk about machine learning, and now we have to talk about AI, right? And the terms change, but the kind of core methods, the core actors, the core considerations and concerns sort of track across these conversations. And so I'm kind of less interested in which term we use, partly because there is no universal term. There's no knockdown term that's going to capture everything that could come up. There's no knockdown term that's going to sort of appease every possible party. But what I do think is useful in that conversation is thinking strategically and what kinds of terms are going to help you marshal the appropriate resources in the appropriate contexts. So there may be contexts where ethics is the word you need to use because that's the word that opens up the conversation because of histories of professional ethics in a given organization or industry. But then it might be the case where if ethics is causing a kind of tunnel vision in, say, an academic program where people hear the word ethics and they say, well, we need the philosopher who can talk about deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics, and then we're done, right? If it's putting that kind of constraint on how you're conceiving of this landscape, well, then yeah, maybe then absolutely we need to intervene and think about responsibility, think about commitment, think about political obligation in a broader sense, or justice, right? There are a lot of ways to approach this, but so I'm sort of less interested in like which move is the right move, and more which move is the strategic move given what you're trying to accomplish in a given context.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I've also noticed how this is important. It's an important way to frame. It depends a lot on who you're talking to. If you're talking to governments and local governments specifically, or federal governments, if you're writing a grant application, and it depends a lot on who you're talking to and which stakeholders are you trying to establish a dialogue with. And in terms of stakeholders, I was thinking, because in your report you mentioned right in the beginning that harmful and even violent nature of data science and technology, and I really appreciate the use of the word harming there. I do believe that most of the times bias can be vague enough so we can like evade accountability or responsibility, if you mean. And you say that these harms have been made visible and further contextualized by a number of different stakeholders and actors and people, not exactly in academia, but also outside, like civil society, community organizations, and data scientists as well. And here in Charlottesville, we have important associations of residents, for example, that want to flip the narrative, and instead of researchers going to them, they want to come to the university with questions and needs. And many disciplines and programs have historically played a problematic role in the community surrounding our campus, including data-driven projects. So this raises various ethical concerns for sure. And so in your experience, how can we engage with our local communities as professors, as instructors, creating a bridge between students and community organizations, and also making sure their voices are heard when we teach what an ethical approach to data science should be?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I think, my initial reaction to this question is actually part of like, I don't know, I'm not an expert in community relations, and we should talk to people who are. And I don't mean that sort of in a pithy way, but I think that is quite illustrative of the scope of the issues that that data science education sort of implicates or generates, and there is a sort of chronic problem of investing in people, so that if you're the person who has some skills, or you're bringing the knowledge in sort of social and ethical topics, well, you have to be the one who has knowledge for all of that, right? Like you don't get to be like the expert in your corner of your academic universe anymore in certain ways. You're now like, oh, you're the ethics person, so you need to do community relations. We need to talk about diversity and inclusion. You need to talk about unintended consequences. You need to talk about bias. You need to talk about privacy and security. And suddenly you're just like, I mean, that is I will tell you, that is direct path to job dissatisfaction, right? Like anytime people are being asked to wear so many hats and hats outside of their competencies and expertise. And so I think that that sort of is reflective of this ongoing problem. And we can also, I want to confess, like we can also, those of us who work in social, political, or sort of economic considerations surrounding data technologies, we can be complicit in that too, right? Because we see opportunity, or we see funding, and so we can also like overstep and overextend our bounds and lay claim to expertise that's not exactly ours, but like it seems close enough, and no one else here seems to be doing it, which is very different than sort of advocating for more tenure track lines, more for better treatment of teaching faculty, et cetera, right? It's a very different orientation. So we can be complicit in that problem as well. But one thing I will note about this sort of idea of external communities and the academy versus the surrounding environment, and different voices, is that it's important to note that the university is walled in many ways. But it's also important to note which of those walls are sort of fictions that we carry with us to sort of preserve our own identity as scholars. And so, and I'm making this move on purpose because I find that sometimes the orientation towards we need more diverse voices, we need to bring in people from the outside, right? It's a very extractive gaze. And so I'm turning the lens on scholars very deliberately here. And when I say that some walls, some divisions are fictions, the people that come into our programs, the students that come into our classrooms, the faculty that join us, don't just shed the rest of their lives because they enter into our space, right? They in many ways, those voices are already present. We're constantly creating the problem, framing the problem as outside. But we have students who come from the very communities that we're talking about. We have faculty who come from the communities that we're interested in or concerned with. We have staff who are connected to these communities. So people don't just like enter into an academic building and then become like a student with a blank slate with no external commitments and values and experiences. And so I think that's one piece of it, that there's a way that I think we can think hard about why we maintain the internal and external distinction and what that allows us to do, what that allows us to accomplish. And then second, I think there's also a problem of that internal external divide, in that we often there's been quite an increase in appeals to quote unquote sort of lived experience. That and I'm thinking here about the work by post-colonial theorist Lewis Gordon, who talks about who has done a lot of work showing how the appeal to lived experience to sort of give others a hook into a space, to give others legitimacy, can have some perverse consequences. Because experience is never just experience. Your experience in your community, in your life, is never just experience. You also make sense of it. You are also a theorist of your life. You are also a thinker of what's happening to you. And when we reduce others, or we reduce outside, quote unquote, outsiders to as having, we reduce them to being valuable only insofar as they can bring a lived experience that's different from those of us inhabiting the academy, we are sort of simultaneously saying that we're the ones then who are best positioned to interpret that experience and then make sense of that experience and then enroll it into our processes, enroll it into our ethics, et cetera. It's equally extractive, right? It can be equally extractive. and equally sort of delegitimizing. And so Lewis Gordon also has this idea, I heard him say this in a talk once, and I absolutely love it, where what people want when they're talking about, bring ethics to the conversation, bring ethics into the program, or come consult, be the ethics consultant on a project. In many ways, what they're asking for, what they want is risk-free action. What they want is to say, tell me how to do it right, so I don't get yelled at. Tell me how to do it right, so I don't get in a PR mess. Tell me how to do it right. They want risk-free action. That's not how action works. Full stop. And so one of the things I think in this conversation of sort of what sort of diverse voices or different voices should point us to is this idea of risk. And are we willing to risk ourselves? Are you willing to risk yourself as the sort of arbiter of what lived experiences are informative? Yourself as the arbiter of what counts as authentic or valuable knowledge in the context of data science ethics. I don't know that a lot of us are, to be frank. But that would be the provocation I would leave.
That's a great provocation, and I think it helps a lot to think so many things. The idea of the heads, and sometimes it feels like just a stamp on a project, on a syllabus, saying like, okay, this is ethically approved, and we consulted with people, so it's good to go. And I really appreciate your take on this, because it's very important to us. And the use of the word destructivist, because this came up in some conversations with other stakeholders as well, and other people. And it's just like, how can we avoid this? And how can we prevent this from happening again in the future, especially dealing with data scientists going to different communities and getting projects going without like much, let's say, responsibility or an ethical approach, and leaving the people there feeling like they were just kind of used it for some project or for some courses. So I think these are great provocations for sure. And there is no easy answer. And I really appreciate you saying like having students here and people in our space contributing to this discussion constantly all the time, and not just like within this framework of ethics and specific courses and projects is very, very important. Caitlin, should we open for the audience Q&A, or do we have time for another question?
Why don't you go ahead and ask another one, and then audience, if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And again, going back to the report, and this is something that I was just considering, because you do this great job in analyzing the assignments, role playing, and all these ways like science fiction and arts, and these ways of like bringing the problems to the classroom too. And I was wondering, after reading the report, if you have any insights during the project or in your experience teaching data ethics about feedbacks from students in these areas, both formal and informal kind of feedbacks and evaluations about what's working and what is not working in those different approaches that you were analyzing.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, there are some common themes, and again, it's really it's hard to universalize, right? There can be quite, I think about I had this pointed out to me by Ryan Shaw, who's at the high school at North Carolina, in a sort of broader group conversation, but pointed out that there are students coming into say data science programs specifically because they're already embroiled in sort of political, social projects. And the problem is not that they need to learn about, the impact of data technologies on racialized groups. And they're actually the expert. That's why they're there. And they're trying to gain technical skills in order to gain legitimacy in certain other spaces and conversations so that they can continue to advocate, right? Like there are these situations where the those of us that are the teacher have absolutely nothing to teach our students in that regard, but can offer them other things that that allow them, whether credentials and the like, that give them legitimacy in other spaces, and that's a really, I think, important reframing and a way to think about how some students are coming to these topics. But beyond that, there are common themes, I think, in both the literatures, both the emerging conversation of data science ethics education and these antecedents, is that students learn by doing in certain ways. These imaginative and speculative exercises around, say, science fiction, developing fictional scenarios, people advocate for them, and students sometimes like them because they create a kind of safer, I don't want to use safe space in a pejorative sense, but I want to say like a safer space for exploring issues, because you're not sort of, you're speculating. You're not talking about something that might hit closer to home for some students than others, and create a dynamic in that classroom that can be quite thorny, and not every instructor is going to be equipped to navigate. So there are some benefits to that kind of approach. One of the things I've struggled with, though, is that given the sometimes cursory nature, even if it's a standalone course where you can go into a little more depth, but then they sort of leave and you never see certain students again. I have real ambivalence about my experiences teaching teaching critical and ethical approaches and perspectives on data science and data technologies, precisely because I have seen students' worldviews shift in ways that are really productive and interesting. But I've also seen students who learn the language, the lingo, but not the lesson. And they're able to sort of move forward, and now they can describe their work using terms like equity, or using words like power. But I don't know that I always see that it fundamentally changes the nature or trajectory of the work. And to me, that's a distinction, right? That's being able to dress up the work in a certain language. And I think that is one of the sort of chronic or ongoing problems of interdisciplinarity, and the interdisciplinary nature of this work is that we don't have good mechanisms for sort of accountability in our applications of knowledge across disciplines. So we may all think and work sort of in interdisciplinary ways, but at the end of the day, our stuff's still getting reviewed. Reviewers still get selected. They get selected for certain kinds of expertise. They focus on that kind of expertise when they review work that goes out into the world. This is a common problem that, like ACM venues, for example, where a technical project will evoke a social issue, but it won't be reviewed by anyone who's an expert in that sort of social issue, right? Just for the technical aspect. And so I maintain this sense of ambivalence because of the lack of what I see as a continued sort of lack of accountability in how we use and apply and carry interdisciplinary knowledge into the world. And I see our students struggling with that.
Thank you. That's very interesting as well. I think it's very important for us.
Yeah, me too. All right, thanks, Jess. We have a question from the audience. Siobhan writes, I work in international development where the term responsible data is used. How then would you increase linkages between academic and implementers, especially as on-the-ground experience of real impacts can be illuminating?
Yeah. I don't know. How do you do it? This is, this is one of those things where I could say, I want to say something about how we think about the lives of these terms in different spaces, and that being able to understand responsibility in the across its deployments in different spaces may allow you to link up with different kinds of academics. So if you know how responsibility is used in environmentalism, or you know how it's used in, political philosophy and ideas of political obligation and responsibility, right? It can be the term can open doors and become that object that you build consensus around. But I don't know that that's actually particularly helpful to you and where you're at, because of the sort of applied and specific nature of some of these challenges. And so I'm sorry that I'm going to have a very insufficient answer. But thanks for the question. I think it's an important one.
Yeah, and I think it gets at this issue that you're pointing at, Anna, about like who is doing data ethics, who is responsible for data ethics? Is it the practitioners? Like, yes, of course. Is it all the rest of us? Yes. In terms of being instructors, in terms of being theorists. And so in some ways, Siobhan's getting at this idea that we can't teach data ethics, we can't develop data ethics without knowing what the problems are that they're encountering, but we also need to help them define the problem in the sense of Donna Riley's view of problem formation.
And I also note too, there's also this sense in this conversation, and I fall into this trap all the time. So I'm indicting myself when I say this, but like we also have a sense that we're the ones leading in this work. But I will tell you that corporate cloud services have extensive ethics documentation. Google and Amazon have extensive tools and tutorials on things like fairness in machine learning. And in terms of sort of practical effect, if you're a business and you're using these cloud services and you're using these tools or these modules that you can then sort of add to your service, add to your business, are you going to be learning your data ethics from Dr. Lauren Hoffmann at the University of Washington in my seminar? Or are you going to be learning it from the FAQ and the tutorial that Google Cloud offers you? I know what the answer to that question is. I don't think it's a bad. I don't think it's a bad thing that there is a conversation and a set of resources that have been developed to address these issues on especially in the business to business context. But it should be a moment of reflection for academics of like, to what degree are we actually leading this conversation in position to have the most effect? Because I don't know that is particularly true.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is an issue that we all struggle with. How do we make what we're doing matter for practitioners, and how do practitioners work with us in ways that are productive for us too? So Jess, what's your thoughts on Siobhan's question about how we can sort of bridge this gap between academics and practitioners?
I have a few thoughts. Maybe I do a lot of research with governments, which is you learn a lot in the process. Trying to create these bridges between practitioners, academics, civil society, sometimes when they are invited to the table, and industry too. I think, I don't know, let me see how I can frame this quickly. It's really, really challenging sometimes to get everybody on the same page, even what we understand by ethics. And that's why I also ask about like the ethics and responsibility, because I see these shifts. They're almost as if they were interchangeable things, but there is like a huge concern about ethics in the government. For example, they're like really, really concerned about ethical deployment of AI initiatives, for example, like how do you ensure ethics, but they don't talk that much about harm or consequences or accountability or even governance. And so you bring these things to the table, and sometimes it's a little bit like difficult to make sure everyone is understanding. each other in this process. So I'm fascinated by this process of trying to make people from different disciplines and different sectors, like different areas, to sit down at the same table and talk. And sometimes more frustrating than it is fruitful. But I find it important to try to understand all sides. And if we need to study and even like criticize, as we should, some practices and some projects and some programs, to understand the other sides as much as possible. So I really like value bringing different like voices and people, even if I like deeply disagree with them most of the time. So I think it's important to have like this conversation. These kind of projects are not very common as much as I would like them to be. And then it's even more difficult to translate this from this kind of practical side of it into teaching. And that's why I also asked about like different stakeholders, how can we engage them without like harming more people in the process?
Yeah, thanks. So true. And I was thinking about that in terms of what Anna said about disasters, how we use disasters and crisis to teach ethics. And I've actually gotten pushback about that from my students in data ethics, where they start to complain like, but can't data science be used for good? You know, I think I sort of go overboard on the disasters and all the things that go wrong. And then they get really frustrated. And then I sort of struggle to have examples for them, have case studies of ethical data science, of what it looks like when it's done well. Yeah, please.
A follow-up question on this, because when I was teaching urban data and digital rights for students, then the pandemic came and we moved it online, and it was like quite a heavy course in terms of content, lots of disaster, lots of conflicts, lots of issues. And by the end, the students also asked me like, can we have some hopeful thoughts by the end of the course? And can we see like some nice things going on? Is it just disaster and sadness and problems? And I was going to ask if how do you approach this? If you include this kind of like, let's call it like hopeful, or more like good practice, best practice, good examples, lessons learned in your courses, and if this is something that it's been working out for you in your teaching.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it comes up constantly. Not only in like the classroom, but we also find it a lot in giving talks or presenting work, where there's somebody always wants the hopeful counterpoint, and they want the or tell me who's doing it right, who's doing it well, and who's you're only telling me who's doing it bad. And again, I think I'm really, unsurprisingly, perhaps, I'm really resistant to this frame. If we're talking about problem framings, I'm really resistant to this frame that there is ever a distinct, right, that there is a distinct line between sort of good and bad applications. And I think the way I try to address this with my students is that what I'm trying to talk about or trying to illuminate for them is a set of processes, a set of conditions, and a set of tools that we use to do things in the world and that we use to make sense of the world. And that it's not like there's a set of that those conditions are different for the things that go bad, and those conditions are different for the things that go good, right? There's an underlying sort of logic to what's happening. And so for me, it is often less about saying, I'm not going to spoon feed you the sort of the hopeful cases, but instead we're going to sort of excavate this below, so that you can so that you have a better sort of more sophisticated understanding of the sort of pipeline is a bad metaphor, but like of the sort of the arrangement and pipeline of processes that we use to arrive at outcomes in order to intervene and think about your work in different ways. I'm actually for ethicists, I'm actually quite agnostic about good or bad, because I think often that kind of moralizing calculus is either applied in a kind of reactionary way, and might cloud our ability to have a more penetrating analysis at times, and also partly because of the contextual nature of these applications, the situated nature of these applications. So yeah, I kind of try to. I know this is bad of me in the like sense of there's an interdisciplinary audience. So if I use the F word, if I say Foucault, I'm alienating half of you. But I'm very Foucauldian in the sense of like things aren't good or bad. The power's not good or bad. But it's always dangerous. And that's really the kind of orientation I take, is like I'm not talking about these things as good or bad. I'm talking about them as always dangerous.
Fabulous. Thank you. Yeah, thinking about teaching processes and practices is exactly what I'm trying to do too, not the product, right? The algorithm itself is not ethical. It's about how it was made. All right, fabulous. So that is all the time we have for. Jess, I'm sorry, did you want to add something?
Just said thank you very much. That was great.
Yeah, fabulous discussion. I really appreciate you too. So if audience, we'd like to invite you to continue this conversation on the OEC's discussion boards. To participate, you can follow the link that I hope Courtney will put in the chat for you to sign up as an OEC member, which is free. And if you're a member, then you get access to our newsletter and our discussion forum. So there's going to be a forum for this webinar where we can continue this discussion of Dr. Hoffmann's ideas. Also, please feel free to tweet at Dr. Hoffmann or Dr. Rea with your follow-up questions. And we're looking to launch a community of practice about teaching data ethics. So please let us know if you'd like to be involved in that. And so, yeah, I just want to thank Dr. Hoffmann, Dr. Rea, the OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, our coordinator, Courtney Walker, and UVA School of Data Science. We hope to see you again for the next talk in the series, which is a discussion of data analytics for social justice, led by Dr. Desmond Patton of Columbia University, and that's on November 11th at 12 o'clock. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.